Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Welcome to Czechast, the podcast where we explore all things Czech. I'm your host, Vít Pohanka, and today I have another very special guest. And I decided to change the format a little bit and give my guest a chance to introduce herself. If you could say in a few sentences, who are you and why are you here in Prague?
My name is Karina Giffard and my surname is English, which would indicate that I have something to do with English-speaking countries. So in 1977, I married an Englishman, Peter Giffard, and in that same year I moved over to the United Kingdom.
Okay, we'll get to that in a few minutes, but first let me ask you, you grew up here in Prague, right, in the 1950s and the 1960s. What was it like? What was the city like? We think of the 50s as the time of kind of hard Stalinism, but then the 60s as a very exciting time. So you lived right through it. What was it like?
I wouldn't remember the 50s very much. I was quite young, but the 60s, that was my decade, and like all young people, we were obviously very happy in the 60s. Things began to loosen up. I did my secondary school, which now is called Gymnasium, in Prague, and we all listened to programs like Mikroforum, Houpačka, and they were good times. And I think whenever you're young, it's good times.
Let me just explain that Mikroforum and Houpačka were kind of very popular and quite interesting programs by the Czech radio at that time. At that time it was Czechoslovak radio, I suppose. Would you remember the first time you heard Beatles, for example?
Oh gosh, yes. The Beatles was basically all that we wanted to listen to, and maybe some other bands as well. So I didn't take much interest in the Czech pop music, I'm afraid. We just listened to every record that we could get hold of. However, I would say that also you could feel very much that we were unable to travel to the West. So towards the end of the 60s, I finished my secondary school and chose English as my subject. And the other subject was Russian language to study at university. And it was quite obvious in those days that you didn't have much chance to actually go to England or English-speaking country.
Let me just ask you, when did you study? Was it before 1960? It was before 1968, no?
Yes. I started university in 1967.
The reason why I'm asking is, my parents, for example, told me that, in 1968 there was the kind of window of opportunity.
Yes.
My father traveled to Vienna, for example,
Yes.
to the West.
Yes.
So I would assume that you were quite hopeful, no, as well?
I was more than hopeful. I was actually quite active. So as soon as it was possible, I interrupted my studies. I took a year out after second year and went to England for a year as an au pair, and studied at college for Cambridge proficiency, which I took and passed.
During that year, yeah.
During that year.
So whereabouts in Britain were you?
I was in Buckinghamshire, in the south of England. Very nice area. And obviously I learned a lot also about family life and customs, and which later became very useful to me when I was living in English surroundings, so I knew already a lot of why people did certain things, like sudden urge to have tea at 5 o'clock and those kind of things.
I first got to London in 1988. It was still under communism, but already Mikhail Gorbachev was in power in the Soviet Union. It was kind of thawing as well. For me, that first visit to London especially, but Britain in general, it was a huge, I don't want to call it a shock. It was like I was slapped in the face, but in a good way, if you understand what I mean. And I wonder whether it was similar.
Culture shock, it is
a culture
to us.
shock.
Mainly when I first got off at Heathrow, I was 20. the first thing that struck me on the way was the neatness. Everything looked like neat and tidy. The roads were good, the cars were nice, and everything was like some kind of imaginary land to start with.
Yeah, let me just mention again, I was in London for a few weeks earlier this year. The neatness has kind of is not everywhere now, is it? I mean, to put it mildly. It used to be kind of tidier, no? I mean, I would assume at that time.
It depends where. There are areas in the UK, and most of the neat and tidy, lovely places, I would say, are in the south. Although the northern cities like Manchester, Leeds have come up an awful lot. When I first went there in the 70s, they were pretty depressing, run down, and I have been there in recent years. That's a completely different story. They're pretty snazzy.
That's true. We actually had some interviews here in Czechast with Czech teachers, and I remember speaking to this Czech woman living in Manchester and kind of, telling me how Manchester has improved, when it comes to culture. It became very, very vibrant,
Yes.
multinational. But we are here to talk about you. So you studied in Olomouc, as I did. Why did you, a Prague young woman, I'm afraid to say even a girl these days, young woman from Prague decides to go to Olomouc? Why?
Oh, that was my own idea. I just thought my main thing I wanted was freedom from, living independently of my family. I had very lovely family. They were quite understanding, especially my dad. He said, you haven't studied at university unless you lived at the halls of residence, which he did in Brno in his days. And so I went. It was an adventure. I didn't go to Brno because I was born there, so I thought, well, I've already been there. And Olomouc I had never been to before. First time I went to Olomouc was for my entry exams for 2-day tests.
I actually got to Olomouc a little by accident, I would say, because I wanted to study physical education, believe it or not, in combination with English. And there were only 3 possibilities in Czechoslovakia. One was in Prague, but that was the faculty of physical education, and that was a kind of prestigious place where all the kind of representatives of Czechoslovakia went. And I was afraid that I wouldn't pass the entrance exams in physical education. Then there was Bratislava, that would be too far from me, so I went to Olomouc. But I fell in love with Olomouc, I have to say. I think, for me, the center of Olomouc has got some kind of atmosphere, like Prague. I don't honestly see that in Brno. I don't know whether we've got any listeners in Brno. I'm sorry to say that.
Very much so. It was basically a student town, so I would say that in those days that maybe every 1 in 10 people in the town were students. So wherever you went, and it was a small area around the center, you always met friends, always met people. And if you went into wine cellar, pub, which we did a lot in those days, you always had friends there. So it was very homely, very friendly, especially the Faculty of Arts where I studied, because we had plenty of time for, unlike the medics, for example.
Mm-hmm. One thing that we have in common, and here I need a longer explanation. We both met Josef Jařab. And for the listeners, I should explain that he taught American literature in Olomouc for many, many years. He was arguably the most knowledgeable person in the field of American literature in the whole of Czechoslovakia. He published internationally even at the time when it was difficult for people behind the Iron Curtain to be published. And he never joined the Communist Party. And when I met him in the 1980s, he was really kind of treading a very fine line between becoming an open dissident. He was very close to some of the dissidents. Well, he was friend with dissidents, because that would stop him from teaching. He wouldn't be able to teach. On the other hand, I mean, if you wanted to teach, you had to make some compromises, but he did as little as possible, of course. And I have to say I've gained very personal relationship to him, because as a student in 1989, I became part of the student strike committee. And he was the first teacher. He wasn't a full professor at that time. He was only assistant professor. Exactly, because he wasn't a member of the party, so he couldn't be. And he was the first to support us. It gave us tremendous strength, the kind of moral the moral backing that he gave to us young students who were really frightened because we didn't know, what was going to happen. And I wonder what it was like for you in the 1960s when you met him.
Right. So I was very fortunate because he actually taught me in the fourth year. We had 1 year of American literature, and he ran seminars. And I would say that was probably the most inspiring time, most inspiring experience that I had because, well, Dr. Jarzab had already been to the United States before he started teaching in Olomouc, and he taught in a different style. I was used to that style of looking at books from doing the Cambridge Proficiency course, where you spent a lot of time dissecting, looking at individual book, rather than, as the method in those days was, to learn massive amount of information, who wrote what works, and if you knew all that, practically like telephone directory, you would be doing well in literature. But his approach was completely different. It was a breath of fresh air, and we all loved his seminars.
Exactly. I mean, that was my experience later on, as I mentioned, when I went to Britain. I realized how we weren't taught how to express ourselves, both in writing and in speaking. And he was the only one of our teachers, or one of the few, I mean, I don't want to be unjust to some other people there, who really made us think and express ourselves, and that was a tremendous thing. What were you expecting in 1968 when you couldn't just ignore the things that were happening in Prague? Did you feel in Olomouc, I mean, that the spring is really coming?
Prague spring?
Yeah,
of course we did, and my father was very involved in Prague. So yes, it was a very good period, but it didn't last very long, unfortunately.
And as I was told, you were coming back from the Soviet Union from a study stay when the invasion happened in August '68.
Yes, as I mentioned, my second subject was Russian, and as part of the course, we had a month at university in Leningrad, a course for students of Russian from foreign countries, and we had a fantastic month, which unfortunately ended abruptly when we at the end went to Moscow, and that very same day we heard on the Russian radio that they offered fraternal help, as they worded it, and we were horrified, obviously. It was very scary time, I would say, being abroad when later in the evening we got the Czech radio broadcast, which was calling, for help and describing shooting. And the one very worrying thing was that the second day after that we were a group of about 25 students from my university, and we were visited by a Russian official from the Ministry of Education who offered us to finish our course in Moscow. And we thought, what are they going to do? We all chanted home, home, home. We started stomping our feet, saying home. Nobody would consider staying there but we didn't understand why he offered us that. We thought, are they going to close our universities? Which in the end, obviously, they didn't.
But that was a thing, I mean, that you thought possible, of course.
Yes, because why would they come with such an offer? And also we had to wait there extra few days because we came and we were leaving by train, and the train was carrying all the military and their tanks and things until we were allowed on the first civilian train to return to Prague. So
you had to wait for a civilian train, yeah?
That's right, for the first train allowed to carry.
And how long did it take?
We had to stay there, I think, in all about 5 days. We were originally having 2 or 3 days for sightseeing, but we had to stay 2 or 3 days longer. Mm-hmm. And then when we crossed the border into Slovakia, we were still on that Russian train, because they just make the gauge smaller at the border. And there were lines of people in Slovakia throwing stones at our train because they saw Russian emblems, and so that was quite dramatic. And we were shouting, "Don't, we're students," you know.
If we can come back still a bit to the few days you had in Moscow, what were the people like? Did you have contact with the Muscovites?
Yes, and no. When we went, because we continued with the sightseeing program, and when we went on, say, the underground, everybody had their great big newspaper opened. Everybody was reading that news, but nobody showed any sign or conversation. There was no conversation, just so everybody reading. But then in the evening we were visited by a group of Russian students, and some students came who stayed in the halls over summer. They were maybe African students from abroad, and they were all sympathizing with us. And the Russian students said that they would stage a protest. I don't think they did, because the protest was very small. Then some 7 people came to the Red Square, but they were very sympathetic to us and anti the invasion, the young people.
Did you have any contact with your parents or
none
of
at all?
Because we now live, in a time when we've got phones, cell phones, we've got internet and everything.
We didn't know what was going on at home, other than what we heard in the evening on the Radio Prague broadcast
from this building. And there was shooting in this building.
Yes, all of that was unfolding, but only by hearing about it. That was quite very, very sad time, very worrying, I think.
So were you sad crying, or frightened, or both?
I think you get mixture of being angry, scared, worried, but angry as well, because that was unprovoked.
So we went back to Prague, but then the school started. So we went back to Olomouc. Olomouc actually became the center, the command center of the occupying Russian forces, Soviet forces, I should say, not Russian.
I have a story about that, but...
Go ahead.
We had a little bit of a party at the halls, and the then dean of the faculty, he had a son who studied Czech language at our faculty, and he declared that whoever will get that plaque with saying about Russian commanders and whatever, that he would reward them with 100 crowns. And so we got a little bit merry and a little bit daring. And with one student, a chap, I sat along at about 2 o'clock in the morning with a screwdriver to take down that plaque for a dare. Mm-hmm. And we were sort of taking the screws off and feeling quite proud of ourselves. Then I looked around, and around the back we were totally surrounded by Russian soldiers. And they stood there in silence watching. And then when they saw that I looked at them, they said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm taking this plaque." And because I was quite fluent in Russian in those days. And "Why are you doing that?" So I said, "Because this is our building, our street, and therefore it's our plaque, and I'm taking it." And they just sort of quite nicely said, "No, don't do it, just go peacefully away," which we did. But then a few days later, I got a call from the then head of Russian department, and Professor Zahradka, and he said, "What was that incident out there at the headquarters?" And I said, "What happened?" And he just said, "Look, that's not the way to go forward. You could get into trouble and you might have to finish your studies here. So I warn you, don't, think of other ways." So he was very good, really. And then he said, "Who was the student?" Now he said, "Who was the student with you?" And I said, I won't tell you that, because I asked him how did he know that it was me. And he said, "I can't tell you that." And then when he asked the name of my mate, I just said, sorry, I can't tell you that. And he accepted it.
But you could have been shot, I think, with Russians.
They were not in kind of unfriendly mood. They were just saying, come on, don't be silly.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. I mean, when I studied there much later, slightly less than 20 years later, after 1968, I felt quite sorry for the Russian soldiers. I mean, the privates. I mean, not the officers and some other civilians who were very noisy in some of the bars or cafes, but the soldiers, I felt pity for them.
Yes, and I think these were ordinary soldiers, and it's to this day I don't know how the department got to know, because there was just this friend and me, just the two of us, and it was very quiet, very silent. The town was just sleeping. So,
I mean, just for the benefit of our listeners, I have to say that I had the good luck of being in Olomouc in the early 1990s when the Soviet army actually withdrew, and it was the university, Palacký University, that got most of the buildings, and some of the faculties are now again in some of the places where the Russians used as their officer quarters, or I don't know, some command centers or something like that. So that was it's a story with a good ending in the end of the day. But I also think that we might know, for example, Professor Macháček.
Oh gosh, yes.
Whom I met in the 1990s when he returned to the faculty after many, many years, when he was kicked out of work because he was probably expelled from the party, I suppose, or something.
He was never in the party. No.
So he was similar to Jarab, I mean, in this sense.
Yes, so and he was a brilliant English teacher. Well, he was like a senior lecturer, I'd say, in English terms, and he was just amazing, entertaining and fun. But then after the invasion, he was pretty outspoken, and even I remember some of his sort of remarks and asides that he used to say in lectures, and then they demoted him to be in the study. He was supervising the study, but even that was not good enough for them, so they kicked him out of the university, and he worked then in the heating rooms for the medical institutes, and all the professors and everybody went there for his private English lessons from the best person you could get, and also he would translate their papers for international symposia, and also he would teach them how to present these papers. So he had quite a good time, but nevertheless a whole generation of students missed out on a brilliant lecturer. But he still is alive. He's very old now. Not very well. Last time I asked to see him, he said he wasn't coming out anymore.
I'm sorry to hear that. I have to say that I had the good luck again. When he returned to the faculty in 1990, he invited me and I was going to consultations with him. And what we did, we would just take, he gave me a text to read, and then we would analyze the text from linguistic kind of points, what phenomena there are, what is interesting about it, what is not. So I can assure you that I'm proud, that I had a little taste of his personality.
Yes.
Of his teaching abilities. So when did it become darker, the mood at the faculty? Was it right away after the invasion, or it took some time, didn't it?
Oh no, at the beginning and around, say, the events around Jan Palach, I remember that we were all like one in the grief for this student, and we would demonstrate.
Let me just intercept a little bit. Some of the listeners might know Jan Palach was the student here in Prague who set himself on fire in early 1969, right?
But then, as I said, I went to England for a year in 1969, and when I returned in 1970, a year later, it was a different place. That was already
It was like coming to a different country.
It was very oppressive, and you could feel it. But living in student community, we knew who to trust. We were all like one. We totally blocked out any newspapers, news, anything like that, because we just said, "Oh, they're lying." So we didn't follow any official media, and we lived as tight community of friends and people you could trust, and you knew who you could trust.
You are listening to Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. I'm Vít Pohanka, your host, and today my guest is Karina Giffard, a translator and interpreter, a Czech woman who found new home in the United Kingdom.
So, when did you finish your studies and how did you go about work?
Oh, that was another story. I finished in 1973, given that I extended my studies by 1 year. And then I thought, oh, the world is an oyster, because I spoke very good English, having been to England. And so I was applying for jobs in the Czechoslovak radio, in diplomatic services, but everything got turned down. And even places where they interviewed me or where there was kind of competition for the place, they said I did really well. Somebody said, you won that place, and then they wouldn't have me. And that was because my father by then and my mother were both expelled from the party. My father was very pro-Dubček, and they kind of tended to punish the children of parents who stepped in the wrong direction. And also I had some record of my own from oral modes, perhaps things I said.
Had been reported and recorded,
yes.
I suppose.
Someone told me that was the case, that they got some information that I was criticizing colleagues who entered that socialist youth, which I never did, but I did have a go at them when they did, my friends, and that was apparently on my records.
You know, this kind of aspect of communism in Czechoslovakia, particularly, to punish children for what their parents did, I think, in a way, was the worst thing, that happened here. Because, okay, in the 50s, we did have a bit of a taste of what Stalinism was, but compared to Poland, for example, it was pretty mild here in Czechoslovakia in the 50s. I mean, I'm not, playing down the violence, and a lot of people died in the camps. Yeah. But compared to Poland, when hundreds of thousands of people disappeared in the Soviet lagers under Stalin, we Czechs were spared that, Czechs and Slovaks. But this thing, I mean, that you couldn't study or you couldn't get a job because your parents did something or were, friends with the wrong people, that to me was the most disgusting thing that they could do.
That, obviously. And also that you were trapped, you couldn't travel. There was the Iron Curtain. And also that they filtered information, what you could read, what you could hear. So those three things, I think, were the most difficult to live with. Going back to after I left university, I spent a year looking for work. In the end, I ended up in a kind of cake shop selling cakes and sweets, because you had to have stamp in your identity card that you had employer. Otherwise, you could be in trouble potentially. But they didn't actually screen people for freelance jobs. So I was able to freelance tutor intensive courses of English for technicians and engineers. I did that and earned probably as much money as I would if I had a full-time job. If I did that twice a month, always over a long weekend, that was fun.
And you were living in Prague?
Yes, I was living in Prague, but these courses were residential out of Prague, in Tanvald and those areas. And also, I could interpret for an organization called PIS.
And what was that? Prague something?
Prague
PIS?
Prague
Prague
Service.
Information Service.
I don't want to say the name because it sounds a bit rude in English.
Yeah.
So I was even allowed to interpret, say, for an American boss of trade unions, medical, who came over, and I was in like big cars going around the country, and nobody cared that I was a daughter of undesirable person because there was no questionnaire to fill in, you know. So I had jobs like that, which was very contradictory, really.
On the personal note, in the 1980s, still as a student, I started teaching privately. And that was through another person that we know pretty well, Jaroslav Peperník, both of us.
Yes,
He taught
yes.
me, who was a legendary author
man.
of textbooks of English in then Czechoslovakia. He helped me to find a family of one of the deputy mayors of Olomouc, who was a communist, but very kind of forward-thinking. And I taught his daughters, and through him, I got to interpretation work. And I actually, at that time, I had much more money. I was earning more money than my brother, who was a teacher, a regular teacher. Plus, usually the foreigners that I was translating to, they would give me some tips, which were in hard currency, and it was great, know, in a way.
Yes. If it wasn't for that necessity to have an employer officially, I could have happily been freelance in many ways, because I also did translation for people, and so.
But just for the record, I mean, you couldn't be freelancing full time in a sense.
No. You needed that an employer. Freelance was not on.
So for you, that would be the sweet shop, or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. But then I ended up, by coincidence, through friends of friends, working for a British company, big chemical concern called ICI, and for their rep in Prague. And then I was sent to interpret for technicians and people who came over to start some licensed production of the chemicals. And that's how I met my husband. So I worked there for 3 years, and then we got married.
Okay, what was it like to move from communist Czechoslovakia to very, very capitalist Britain?
It felt free. I should say I said very, very capitalist Britain. Britain was not just capitalist, but that's how it was portrayed here in Czechoslovakia. The company I worked for was very, very capitalist. It was a corporation which spanned the whole world, and but people were very pleasant. Everybody was always very nice to me. It was good to be foreign in that company because they were multinational, so they employed all sorts of people from everywhere. And I was fortunate because, having left Czechoslovakia officially, that means I didn't defect or anything, I could go back. And I must say that I don't think I would have ever been able to defect and shut the door to coming back. I could not cope with that. So I was very lucky that I could just go backwards and forwards. They weren't pleasant to me when I came back at the border, but you can live with that.
What about the secret police, the STB? Did they ever try to get some information from you?
Yes, they did. They kind of waited for me when I came to Prague to see my former employers, the Foreign Trade Organization, and they tried to recruit me to give information. And I said I couldn't talk to them. I said, I can't talk to you. I'm just going home. My husband's waiting for me, because he was also in Prague at the time. And by the time they came to me again, was at the trade fair. I used to attend trade fairs for the company. I was already heavily pregnant, and I was saying, I will never work again. All I'm going to do be mum now, and they left me be. So I never actually was forced to sign anything or agree anything, or
they wouldn't interrogate you. I mean,
they did not get around to it. They were trying to recruit me, but then they kind of I got the file from the STB afterwards, when you could pick it up, and it said that they would discontinue that because I was going to be a housewife and not of interest to them anymore.
What was the life in Britain like? I mean, you were accepted at the factory, at the place of work. How was it with your, if I may ask, I mean, with your husband's family, your mother-in-law and others? I mean, what did they think about that?
Yes. By the way, the company, we were working in the commercial outfit, which had 1,000 people in a very nice area in south of England, far away from any factories. So we didn't get involved in. My husband, he was a chemist, so he would go to the works and do some work in labs, developing products, whatever. Yes, but the family, well, I think that mother-in-law didn't make it secret that she would have preferred Peter to marry an English girl.
That's not very nice. I mean, when you think about it.
She was a bit cold towards me to start with. She was of a very different generation. I thought in attitude she was a Victorian lady.
Still,
She was. I think they kind of were a generation back, his family. They were older parents, and so she was a little bit standoffish to start with, but gradually, especially once I had the children and gave them the heir of the name, we had a son, then she warmed up to me, and in the end she was lovely. She was very nice, yeah.
You know, it's something slightly different, but I remember in this context speaking to Karel Brušák, who was a Czech who emigrated to Britain during Second World War. He was a war veteran. He was a very interesting person. He was quite old when I met him in the 1980s. And let me just explain briefly. In the 1930s, he was a student in Prague. He was a communist. And he went to Spain to fight against Franco in the 30s. Then he came to Britain. But because he was a communist, he told me that he felt very kind of ostracized in the Czechoslovak, army there. I mean, it's a story that's rarely told.
He fought in the army in the Second World War.
Yeah, well, he was working. I don't think that he was a fight. He probably worked for intelligence or something like that.
But they held against him that he
had been a communist. And but it's just one. There's a whole story of how there were different groups of soldiers of military in Czechoslovak militaries, and they not. The relationships were not always ideal, let me put it like that. Nevertheless, Karel Brušák went on, and he ended up teaching at Cambridge. So he was kind of accepted. When I met him in the 1980s, he was coming to London to School of Slavonic and East European Studies, which was part of the then London University. And he was telling me, the reason why I'm telling this long story, that even though he worked, he taught at Cambridge, I mean, this institution, and you would think that he was accepted. But he said, I never felt fully accepted by his colleagues. I've always been the Czech, the foreigner. And I just wonder, I mean, did you start feeling accepted?
Absolutely.
And right at the beginning, or did it take some time?
I think right at the beginning, because my first contact with English people was through work, and as I explained, being multinational company, it was quite common that there were people from abroad working around me. And as far as neighbours, they were always, where we lived, always very friendly. I never had any encounters to the contrary. No, I always felt people often asked about my accent, because that you never shed, but always, where do you come from? When I said sometime they mixed up Czechoslovakia with Yugoslavia, they would say things like, oh, such a shame about the war. So I said, we don't have a war. And that sort of thing. But no, I never had, I felt maybe more so because my husband was English, and where we socialized with people, because we were mixed family, It was fine. We had friends.
It could have been also, I'm just kind of speculating here, that Britain in 1970s was different from the Britain in 1940s and 50s, you know.
Definitely.
I mean,
And
when
it's
it comes to...
still very different now. It is a different country now to when I came there in the 70s.
Just one little anecdote about the accent that you mentioned, that you never get rid of your accent. And my experience in the United States was that people would ask me, where are you from, because of my accent, and I would say I'm Czech, and they say, that's what I thought. I thought you were Russian, for example, they would say. They got to mix that up.
You're lucky
then,
they didn't think you were from Chechnya, which...
I didn't like that very much, and so I started experimenting. And when somebody asked me, where are you from, I said Sweden. He said, I thought you were Swedish. And then I said, well, I'm actually from Portugal. And he said, yeah, I knew that you were from Portugal. I knew that accent, you know. So, I mean...
So you have nondescript accent.
Nondescript accent, mid-Atlantic. So you started a family. How were you speaking to your kids, in Czech or in English?
Well, I would say in principle we were an English-speaking household because of my husband. But I did try speak to them Czech. And of course, my mum would come for quite lengthy stays, sometime 2 or 3 months, and she didn't speak English. So my daughter's first language, when she was a toddler, she spoke Czech rather than English. And but as soon as my mum left and she went to preschool sessions, then she switched to English.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you how long it took, you know, for the children to become kind of anglicized. Was it the school, you know, that decided that?
No, it was earlier than that. I think it was preschool and having little friends, and they would be isolated if they didn't speak English, wouldn't they? And so we always tried to speak Czech, but then they reached a stage where my son, around 10 years old, said, "Mom, don't speak to me in Czech when there are my friends around." So I made a point to call to him in Czech every time around the school, because I said, no, we're not doing that. I think children don't like to be different, and that was what caused it, really.
That's really interesting.
But they both got to a stage where they understand, they have good understanding. If they have to they can get by perfectly well in Prague and get what they want and ask where they want to get. But generally, they prefer to speak English whenever anybody speaks English to them.
So, do you think that they kind of have any Czechness in them? I mean,
yes, I think they do. And they always said that, and they always loved coming here. And they also very much like my friends. We had so many visitors over the years, and they always liked our friends. And I think my daughter, she's the older one, she said, when she was quite young, she said, "I feel lucky that I have 2 countries to call a home," which I thought was quite profound from a 12-year-old or however old she was. And they're still interested, but now they have not been coming much lately. My daughter came before Christmas for a little while, but she's got a dog, and it's difficult.
Oh, yeah, I imagine.
And my son, they have a young baby, so they don't really feel inclined to travel.
Too much, right.
Too much. But they always had a sense of being half Czech, and they would always say that I'm half Czech.
I just wonder, do you think it's important in today's world?
It is important, but
Why?
do...
Why is it important?
Your identity is important, to know where you come from and the culture, and why I'm perhaps a little bit different in some ways from certainly like the strange lady who goes picking mushrooms and stinging nettles and things and pick windfalls, apple windfalls, which English people generally don't do. So I think they like that bit of difference.
Were you homesick, I wonder, even though you had the tremendous privilege, not like other people who really defected, you could come to Prague basically whenever you wanted, right?
I did get homesick, but most of all, I missed my close friends because I made some very strong friendships at university, which still are lasting now, and I miss those friends for a chat because we did a lot of chatting at the halls of residence, and I miss those sort of close friendships. But I made friends there too, eventually, and it was.
Were you the kind of typical, the aunt from Britain who would come to Czechoslovakia with a lot of presents,
Yes.
consumer goods, that we couldn't have here?
It was always big part of coming back was the shopping for all the gifts and remembering everybody. And I enjoyed that. And nowadays that's gone because people still like to receive tea, proper Yorkshire tea. That's
just a little anecdote. When I was coming back from London back in the 1980s, I didn't know what to buy to my aunt. And I remember I got her this huge bottle of ketchup, Heinz ketchup.
Mm-hmm.
She was so happy. I mean, these days, if you brought ketchup to somebody, what would they think about that? But at that time, I made her truly happy.
Yes.
With that
There
ketchup.
were things like that. And it was remembering who liked what and, so.
So, when did you start feeling home? Was it again right away or did it take some time? In Britain, I mean.
In the UK, I started feeling really at home once I had the children, and I became much more part of the community in the village. And I met other parents, and we went to all these kind of clubs for mother and baby, and then around schools, and I was always very active. I suppose my unfulfilled educational background, I was always involved in PTA, Parent Teacher Association. In every school, I was on board of governors in the secondary school. And so I met lots of people in meetings and out of privately. And I felt at home. And I still do feel at home there.
So when did you decide, you are now in Prague, so you are spending more of your time in Prague now, right?
Yes, it turned around. Since my husband passed on 5 years ago, I made that decision that I will spend more time in Prague, and I'm very lucky because I have an apartment, small apartment in Prague 6, and I've more or less moved here. Except that I go back very frequently because my children live there and my now grandson.
So where do they live? I mean, still in Buckinghamshire or?
No, I didn't. We lived in Hampshire. That was Buckinghamshire was where I was au pair. But then
you mentioned that.
My family right on the border of Hampshire, Surrey, and Sussex. 3 counties meet at my village of Liphook, where I lived. And I just gifted our family house to my children. So my son lives there. And my daughter, she lives in Brighton, in a very bright, very vibrant, interesting city of Brighton. I do alternate between the two of them. So I spend equal time with my daughter and my son and his little family. I would say I'll spend a good few months in Prague and then go over for this time. I'm going tomorrow for 6 weeks.
Good for you.
That's yeah.
So are you following, just out of curiosity, I'm not asking if you are a fan of anyone, but are you following the British politics? You've got a new Prime Minister.
Absolutely. I'm quite a political animal and I follow politics over there and over here.
You vote in Britain?
I vote in both.
In both?
Yes.
Lucky you.
So last time I voted in the UK in the election by proxy in the recent parliamentary elections. So I gave my proxy vote to my son and I was pleased with the result. And when I vote here, I've been here, but in the presidential elections about a year and a bit, I went to vote at the embassy in London. I was visiting the UK, so I went to cast my vote there twice.
So it's important for you to vote,
It is important, and I have taught my children that you can't ever complain about anything if you don't actually use your right to vote, and they do take it seriously as well.
That's very honorable, I think. Anyway, that's good that you do that. But let me ask you, so you vote there, you vote here. Are you British or are you Czech?
I am both. I have dual nationality. I have always felt Czech more than British. I am not British. I think your home is where you grew up, basically, and you can only have one real home. But I feel at home in the UK as well. So I'm
I was just going
fortunate
to say
that, but I can't pretend to be English or British.
I was just going to say, I mean, I feel at home only about my real home is in Vysočina region, the Highlands region, but I spent quite a few years here in Prague. So when I come to Prague, I mean, I feel at home.
Yes.
And the same applies to London, actually. I feel at home in London.
Yes.
So
I feel at home when I enter the UK. I like to have a chat with the immigration officers, have a laugh and a joke, and, you just feel like coming home. Yeah.
And in a way, you're lucky because you feel home, with both ways, right? I mean, because you can come back home to Prague or come back home to London or the UK.
When I'm there for several weeks, staying with my children, who are lovely and very nice and always make me very welcome, but I always yearn to be back in my flat, my independence, my kind of realm.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming here, for speaking to us, and I'm pretty sure that we are not talking for the last time, because there's so many things that I would like to talk to you about in more than just an introductory way. Thank you.
That would be a pleasure, and it was a pleasure talking to you.
That was my conversation with Karina Giffard. If you enjoyed this episode of Czechast, please consider subscribing or following us on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. We also want to hear from you. If you have any comments, suggestions or ideas for future guests, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can write to us or connect with us on radio.cz or social media. I'm Vít Pohanka, host of Czechast at Radio Prague International. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, take care and keep exploring the rich tapestry of Czech life, culture and history.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.